This is Marvin, and he was an airline captain, but he was also every passenger's worst nightmare. And this was all that was left of the wreckage after he crashed, killing 18 people on board the plane. And the investigation that followed revealed some of the most disturbing behavior and arrogant mistakes that I've ever talked about on this channel. In fact, the more you learn about Marvin, the worse the story gets. I'm Hoover, and welcome to your pilot debrief. Our story begins on December 1st, 1993, when two pilots and 16 passengers boarded an airplane in Minneapolis for what was supposed to be a short flight to the Range Regional Airport in Hibbing, Minnesota. Most of the passengers were traveling for the holidays, and despite the winter weather, they trusted the airline they were traveling on, and they trusted the pilots flying the plane. Now, everything seemed to be going fine as the first officer made an announcement that they'd be landing shortly. Tragically, 13 minutes later, they'd all be dead after the aircraft slammed into a hillside a few miles short of the runway. The shocking part, though, is that nothing was wrong with the plane. And that's why, to better understand how this flight was essentially a death trap, we need to start by looking at the pilots flying the plane. Chad was 25 years old, and he was the first officer sitting in the right seat for the flight. According to the investigation, Chad failed his initial check ride for both his private pilot certificate in 1985 and his flight instructor certificate in 1987. However, his dream in life was to be an airline pilot one day, and that's why he continued to work hard, gaining experience as a flight instructor while also attending the University of North Dakota. Eventually, in 1993, he was hired as a first officer for a company called Express 2. The only caveat was that he had to pay $8,500 of his own money to go through training to get qualified on the British Aerospace Jetstream 31, also referred to as the BA-3100, but we'll talk more about that aircraft in a minute. For right now, you have to keep in mind that first officers only made about $18,000 a year at that time, so this was a substantial investment for Chad, and he took it very seriously. In fact, during his initial training, he was the only one out of 6 candidates to pass the simulator check ride on the first attempt, which was in September of 1993. Chad would go on to finish his initial operating experience with the company on October 7th, and that was just 2 months before the crash. The Czech airmen that he flew with, as well as other pilots at the company, had nothing but nice things to say about Chad, and the truth is that Chad had even taken the time to make handwritten note cards that he took with him on each flight, containing all the details of the airports that the company flew to. So basically, Chad was going above and beyond because he didn't want to do anything to jeopardize his new career. Now, that being said, when it comes to the accident flight, Chad was excited about the trip since he hadn't flown very much in the past several weeks, and according to his flight records, he had just over 2,000 total flight hours, but at the time of the crash, he only had 65 hours in the Jetstream 31. The reason why this is so important is because it meant that he was still on probation, and without having a lot of experience on the aircraft, let alone experience as an airline pilot, my guess is that he was probably going to defer to the experience of the captain when it came to the operation of the aircraft. Unfortunately, that was going to be a big mistake. Marvin was 42 years old, and he was the captain flying the plane at the time of the crash. According to the investigation, prior to being an airline pilot, Marvin served in the U.S. Navy as a reactor officer on a nuclear submarine, but he also got his private pilot certificate during that time. According to his records, he failed his initial check ride for both his commercial and flight instructor certificates, but eventually he passed, and he ended up doing some flying as a charter pilot. Then in 1987, he was hired by a company called Express 1, which was the predecessor to Express 2 that I mentioned earlier when we talked about Chad. When Marvin was hired, he started off as a first officer on the Saab SF-340, a twin-engine turboprop designed to seat about 30 passengers. However, during training, he failed the initial oral exam portion of his check ride, but passed later that same day. Then about a year later, he failed a proficiency check in the aircraft due to his judgment in some of the emergency procedures, but once again he was provided additional training and passed shortly thereafter. After another year with the company, Marvin upgraded to captain on the Jetstream 31, and things seemed to be going well, but eventually he was looking for a pay raise, and that's why in 1990 he started training to become a captain back on the Saab SF-340. Now, for what it's worth, this should have been a pretty smooth upgrade since he had previous experience on the aircraft, and because he had been with the company for at least 3 years, he had a pretty good grasp on how the airline operated. Unfortunately, during that upgrade, his instructor said that he was difficult to train because he was headstrong, argumentative, and thought that he was always right, and would go on to say that the first officer was intimidated by Marvin because he was extremely overbearing, and it took 12 hours of flying together for the first officer to get used to him. Despite his struggles, Marvin eventually completed training and became a captain on the Saab SF-340. Now, this is the point where I'd like to say that Marvin turned things around and his attitude completely changed, but the truth is that the story is about to get a whole lot worse. That's because one of the things that I haven't told you yet is that during his first 2 years with the company, Marvin had 4 sexual harassment complaints filed against him, including a severe warning from the company. Additionally, in September of 1989, Marvin was subject to a 3-day suspension for negative reports related to his performance, including starting an engine while a ramp agent was standing near the propeller, delaying the start of a flight so he could finish his breakfast, destroying a cargo load report he wasn't happy with, and according to a passenger complaint, he was also seen sleeping in the cockpit during a flight. These are the kind of things that would typically get someone fired, but instead Marvin ended up serving as a captain on the Saab SF-340 for about 2 years, and then in August of 1992 he failed a proficiency check for unsatisfactory crew coordination, amongst other things. That was his second failed check ride with the company, and this is where things really started to unravel. You see, up until this point, Marvin lived in Minneapolis, and he commuted to an outstation for all of his flights. However, in September of 1992, the company changed its policy and made it mandatory for pilots to live at their assigned outstations, and they could no longer commute to work. A lot of the pilots were obviously upset about this, but Marvin was furious because it meant that he was going to have to move, and the only way for him to stay in Minneapolis was to become a captain on the Jetstream 31 since that aircraft was based there. However, that meant a 12% pay cut, and also Marvin would have to be a reserve pilot, meaning that he wouldn't have a set schedule, and instead he'd have to fly whatever trips that the company assigned to him. And honestly, I think this is what pushed him over the edge, because he started trying to make things as difficult as possible for the company, the passengers, and the first officers that he flew with. But the story doesn't end there, because in May of 1993, he failed another proficiency check, his third failure. But to top it all off, a first officer reported that Marvin hit him during a flight one time because he had left the intercom turned on for too long. All that being said, at the time of the crash, Marvin had just over 7,800 total flight hours, including over 2,200 hours as a captain in the Jetstream 31. But now that you know some of the disturbing details about Marvin, it's time to talk about the aircraft they were flying in and the other holes in the Swiss cheese that needed to line up for this crash to happen. The aircraft that Marvin and Chad were flying in was a 1986 British Aerospace Jetstream 31, and it's a turboprop aircraft capable of carrying 19 passengers, and it required 2 pilots to operate. However, you need to understand that when you have 2 pilots in the cockpit, flying is a team sport. But tragically, this was a situation where you had a very steep authority gradient, where Chad was most likely reluctant to speak up or challenge anything that Marvin did, especially because of Marvin's arrogance and disturbing behavior. When it comes to the investigation, the NTSB determined that there was nothing mechanically wrong with the aircraft that would have contributed to the crash. The aircraft wasn't equipped with a flight data recorder, but the NTSB was able to use the radar data from the flight, and also they recovered the cockpit voice recorder that captured the last 30 minutes of the flight and the shocking decisions that were made. But we'll take a look at that in a second. For right now, one of the other factors that played a role in this tragedy was the weather. On the night of the crash, the National Weather Service depicted an area of low pressure over north-central Minnesota with widespread overcast clouds, including areas of snow and freezing drizzle. Additionally, before and after the accident, several pilots had reported encountering continuous light and occasional moderate rime icing in the clouds near the crash site. However, to be perfectly clear, the aircraft was approved for operations in icing condition, and it was equipped with an airframe ice protection system capable of handling these kinds of conditions. Now, we're going to talk more about the weather when we look at what happened during the flight, but first, the NTSB had to figure out why Marvin was even on the plane to begin with. Before we talk about what happened next, let me just say that between flying, making videos, and family life, finding time to cook something that actually fuels me has always been tough. You know, I used to end up grabbing whatever was quick, and that's not exactly the kind of fuel that a pilot should be running on. That's why I use Factor, and honestly, I think you should too. Their meals are fresh, never frozen, and they help take the guesswork out of clean eating. All I have to do is take one of their meals, poke a few holes in the top, then throw it in the microwave for 2 minutes, and I've got a chef-crafted meal that actually fits my lifestyle. And the thing is, the new Factor menu just expanded to over 80 rotating weekly meals, and that's double what they used to have, and that means now there's more protein and seafood options like salmon and shrimp at no extra cost. But what I really like is the flexibility. You see, if you love chicken but you hate pork chops, you can swap proteins for free. It's totally customizable. Factor even helps support your goals with balanced, high protein, and calorie smart meals that are perfect if you're trying to stay fit or just eat smarter without thinking about it. So head to factor75.com or click the link below and use code PILOTFB50 to get 50% off your first Factor box plus free breakfast for 1 year. That's code PILOTFB50 at factor75.com to get 50% off plus free breakfast for a year. And now let's get back to the video. In order to find out why Marvin wasn't fired prior to this crash, the NTSB started by taking a closer look at the company he worked for and the role of the FAA in all of this. That's when they made several shocking discoveries. First of all, the company chief pilot said that he knew Marvin had issues dealing with people and he counseled him, but no one complained about his technical competence as a pilot, so essentially he just brushed aside the issues. Second of all, the company director of operations claimed that he was unaware of any issues with Marvin, even though he had frequently counseled him for problems including his conduct, sexual harassment, and disagreements he had with others. Third, you have to remember that Marvin was a reserve pilot at the time of the crash. Well, that meant he got assigned the trips that other captains didn't want, and as a result, he would often fly with really junior first officers who were also on reserve, some of them who were still on probation since they hadn't been with the company long enough, like Chad. The reason that matters is because it meant Marvin had to write performance reports on the first officers on probation that he flew with, and if you didn't get a good report, you could probably lose your job. So there was zero chance these new first officers were ever going to complain about Marvin, which is why the DO told the NTSB that Marvin's CRM must have been pretty good because nobody said anything to the contrary. The fourth shocking discovery had to do with oversight from the FAA. You see, when Express 1 was started in 1985, the FAA assigned a POI to them. And if you're not familiar, a POI is an experienced pilot that works for the FAA, and they're responsible for overseeing the company's compliance with safety regulations. The only problem was that despite his 24-year career with the FAA, the POI had never attended the FAA's POI training course. Additionally, he attended ground school to learn the systems on the Jetstream 31, but he failed twice. And even though he never passed, he was the one responsible for approving the training for pilots on the aircraft, later admitting to the NTSB that he wasn't familiar with the aircraft systems or icing characteristics. If that wasn't bad enough, when Express 2 was created, a second POI was hired to oversee their operations. But that person lived at least 100 miles away from Express's nearest pilot base. He wasn't rated to fly any of the aircraft the company operated. He didn't have experience as a pilot for a Part 135 air carrier, and he had never been a POI for a Part 135 air carrier prior to being hired. In fact, he only got the job because he asked for it, saying that he thought it would be good for his career development. After the crash, when the NTSB interviewed the two men and asked them how they coordinated, specifically when it came to pilot training and check rides, the POI for Express 1 said that he wouldn't talk to the POI for Express 2 because he didn't want to tell him how to run his certificate. Now, in full transparency, I'm not trying to say that the POI was responsible for this crash. Rather, the point I want to make is that these layers of supervision are just like slices of Swiss cheese that are designed to stop guys like Marvin from making it through the system. But when they're not doing their job, the holes in the Swiss cheese are a lot bigger, and the next thing you know, Marvin is showing up at the airport to get ready for the flight, and the passengers have no idea that Marvin would be their biggest threat. On the day of the crash, Marvin and Chad arrived at the airport around 1:30 p.m. local time, and the plan was for them to travel as non-revenue passengers on a flight from Minneapolis to Falls International Airport, where they would swap out with the pilots and fly the aircraft back to Minneapolis. Then they were supposed to fly to Hibbing and do another leg to Falls International, where they would stay the night and return to Minneapolis the next day. First of all, Marvin was mad because remember, he's a reserve pilot and he got the trip assigned to him the day before it started, and it was a 2-day trip even though he was scheduled to have the day off work on that second day. Things only got worse from there because when Marvin went to board the plane for the first flight as a passenger, the authorization for his travel hadn't come through yet. So he insisted that the gate agent stop everything she was doing and call dispatch to get his authorization. However, because that's normally the pilot's job, the agent told Marvin to do it himself. And after a brief argument, Marvin called the chief pilot who said they would handle it. Not surprisingly, that never happened, and I almost feel like they ignored him intentionally just to make him mad, but either way, the gate agent eventually took care of it so that way Marvin wouldn't miss the flight. However, by the time Marvin reached the aircraft, the flight crew had already closed the passenger door and started the number 2 engine, so the pilots had to stop what they were doing to reopen the door for him to board. Keep in mind that Chad's already on the plane, so there's no telling what he was thinking about all of this going on, and to be honest, he was probably secretly hoping that Marvin didn't make the flight. Regardless of all the drama, the plane made it to Falls International, they swapped out with the other pilots, and Chad flew the next leg back to Minneapolis. After they arrived, they had to swap aircraft for the next flight to Hibbing, and that's when Marvin's personality really started to shine. That's because Chad did the pre-flight, but an eyewitness said Marvin was angry because Chad didn't check the exterior lights. Chad tried to explain that he was going to do that from the cockpit, but Marvin told him that was wrong and he went out to check the lights himself. Eventually, when it was time for the passengers to board, Marvin made them stop, and they all watched as Marvin climbed the steps and stood in the passenger doorway, taking off and hanging up his coat before he allowed anyone to board. After everyone boarded the plane and the doors were closed, Marvin realized they were 130 pounds over their max allowable takeoff weight, making him even more frustrated because this was another delay and they had to reopen the door to let one person get off the plane, and then finally they were ready to go and they taxied out for takeoff. When Marvin and Chad took off, the Hibbing forecast called for overcast skies at 800 feet and visibility was 1 to 3 miles due to light freezing drizzle and light snow, and both pilots were aware of the conditions prior to the flight. Now, it's not clear what happened during the first 30 minutes of the flight because when the CVR started, they were already at their cruise altitude, and Chad asked if they were going to get their own room at the hotel for the night, and Marvin told him, "No, you're going to have to room with me, and it's only a single bed so you can curl up at my feet." Now, if you didn't know anything about Marvin, it's easy to assume that he was just joking around, but this was just one of many instances during the flight where Marvin was basically treating Chad like he's an idiot, not realizing how toxic he's making the cockpit environment with his arrogance. In fact, the NTSB would go on to say that the CVR transcript showed that most of Marvin's communications with Chad was either to correct him or to tell him what to do. Regardless, pretty soon they started talking about the Hibbing airport to get ready for the arrival, and what you need to know about the airport is that it didn't have a control tower, which is going to play a role in this later on. But also the airport only had one runway they could land on, and that was runway 3113. Initially, when they checked in with the approach controller, they were told to expect the ILS approach to runway 31. But now the controller said the weather was overcast at 400 feet, the winds were 180 at 10 knots, and the braking action on the runway was poor because of the freezing drizzle. This was going to be another factor that contributed to this crash because with the winds being 180 at 10 knots, that meant they would have a tailwind if they landed on runway 31. So the only other option was to land the opposite direction on runway 13. However, the truth is that Marvin recognized this right away and he told Chad they couldn't land on 31, but because he didn't say why, Chad tried to clarify that it was because of the contaminated runway and the tailwind, and instead of confirming that Chad was right, Marvin just responded, "I don't like to land with the tailwind anyway," almost as if to make the point that he does whatever he wants. I'll admit that Marvin made the right decision to land on runway 13, but the problem was that doing so meant that they would no longer be able to fly the ILS approach, which is a precision approach to get below the weather. Instead, they requested to fly the only approach available to runway 13, which was the localizer back course approach. This is a non-precision approach, and that means they'll have lateral guidance to line up with the runway, but there isn't any vertical guidance to get them down below the weather. Non-precision approaches are more demanding of a pilot, especially because in this case the aircraft didn't have an autopilot, so Marvin was going to have to hand fly the entire approach at night in the weather. So that's why he at least took the time to brief it. He told Chad they were going to fly on the 20-mile arc and maintain 3,500 feet until they were established inbound on the approach. Once they got past Kinney, they could descend to 2,040 feet until they got to 10 DME, which was only about 2 miles from the runway, and then they could descend to their MDA, which was 1,780 feet, or roughly 428 feet above the ground. That's the lowest they can fly and still be in the weather, and this was going to be a very challenging approach, especially because the clouds were at 400 feet. Now, at first glance, it seemed like Marvin gave a pretty detailed briefing, but there were a few things that he forgot to mention that would end up hurting them later on. I also want to point out that Chad didn't have his own copy of the instrument approach because the airline only provided one copy for the crew to share. The reason why this matters is because company policy was for the pilot monitoring to be the one holding the chart during the approach, so Marvin wasn't able to reference it for the rest of the flight, and instead he had to rely on Chad to talk him through it. And at that point, they were cleared to descend at their discretion down to 5,000 feet. For the next 12 minutes, there's no further discussion about the approach. Instead, during that time, Chad called operations at Hibbing to let them know they were going to be landing soon. Then he made a brief announcement to the passengers, and after that, Marvin asked him about the altimeter setting and if Hibbing operations gave him a weather update. Chad said yes, but he was lying. Probably because he didn't want to get yelled at by Marvin. About 5 minutes later, they were established on the 20-mile arc and cleared for the approach, and that's when Marvin asked Chad what altitude they could go down to. Chad told him 3,500, which was correct, but instead of starting his descent, Marvin kept the plane level at 8,000 feet, but Marvin hasn't said a word about why he's not descending, so that's why Chad asked him if he was just going to stay up high as long as he could. Alright, this is where it's important to understand that the reason why Marvin was doing this was because the controller had told him that there was light to moderate mixed icing all the way through the clouds. So essentially, he was trying to stay up high until the very last minute and then do what's sometimes called a slam dunk approach, where you try to descend at a very rapid rate at the last minute to minimize your time in the bad weather, or in this case, he was doing it to minimize his time in the icing conditions. The only problem with doing this is that it can be very dangerous because the longer you wait to descend, the more aggressive you need to be, and things are going to happen much faster than they would if you were flying a stabilized approach. Either way, Marvin never briefed Chad regarding the plan, so at this point, Chad is just kind of along for the ride, and as they got established on the localizer, that's when Marvin finally started an aggressive descent. The biggest mistake that Marvin made with this approach is that he waited too long to start to descend. As a result, they were 1,200 feet high when they crossed the final approach fix, and that's when things really started to fall apart, because at that point they were descending at a rate of up to 3,000 feet per minute, and things were happening very quickly. Marvin called for the before landing checklist, and as soon as they finished that, Chad said 1 to go, meaning 1,000 feet until they got to their intermediate level off at 2,040 feet, not realizing they only had about 30 seconds left to live. Now, after Chad called out 1 to go, he was supposed to make another call out when they were 500 feet above their level off altitude, but unfortunately he never did that and Marvin kept descending. Chad was also supposed to make another call when they were 100 feet above their level off altitude, but he got distracted because that just so happened to be around the same time that Marvin said, "Did you click the airport lights and make sure the common traffic advisory frequency is set?" Now remember how earlier when I told you that the airport didn't have a control tower? Well, Marvin was asking Chad to change the frequency and turn on the lights because in order to conserve electricity, the lights at the airport would only come on when the pilot clicked the microphone a certain number of times on the correct frequency. And once again, this was something that Marvin forgot to include in his briefing, otherwise they could have done it several minutes ago. Instead, he told Chad to do it at the worst possible time, so Chad stopped monitoring their altitude and started focusing on changing the radio and getting the lights turned on, and Marvin continued descending. But to make matters worse, 13 seconds later, Marvin got distracted trying to tell Chad how to do his job, which was the same time they slammed into the trees and crashed into the hillside, killing everyone on the plane. The passengers on board this flight deserve better, and so did Chad, and there's no excuse for what happened. The NTSB said the probable cause was Marvin's actions that led to a breakdown in crew coordination and the loss of altitude awareness by both pilots during an unstabilized approach at night in the weather. That being said, I'd argue that Marvin should have been fired several years before this tragedy, and he was every passenger's worst nightmare. His arrogant and disturbing behavior created a cockpit environment that was so toxic it was a recipe for disaster, and a minor distraction at a critical moment during the approach was the final hole in the Swiss cheese. But I hope that this debrief has been helpful, and if it has, then the best way to support the channel is to watch another video, and I'll see you on the next debrief.